Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à ce premier webinaire des Midi Santé de l'IID et d'Ivado. Mon nom est Barbara Dessel, je suis la conseillère à la recherche en santé et avant de laisser notre invité vous présenter son projet, je vais me permettre de dire 2-3 mots sur Ivado et de vous présenter cette initiative. Donc, Ivado est un institut universitaire dont la mission est de promouvoir et de soutenir la recherche en intelligence numérique et en data science. Une de ses principales missions est aussi de faire le pont entre l'expertise académique et les industries. Donc, si vous ne pouviez retenir qu'une seule image d'Ivado, ça pourrait être ce pont que vous voyez sur votre écran. Plus spécifiquement, dans le domaine de la santé, Ivado s'est beaucoup impliqué dans ce secteur, notamment depuis sa création. Nous avons financé plus de 40 projets de recherche fondamentale. Nous avons 8 professeurs Ivado spécialisés en santé numérique. Nous finançons 4 recherches professionnelles de recherche et plus de 200 étudiants. Nous soutenons aussi divers événements dans ce secteur, tels que des symposiums, et nous organisons aussi des formations. So, hi everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you today and to present our series of webinars, les Midi Santé de l'IID et d'Ivado. So today our guest speaker is Reg Joseph from LCT. But before to let our guest speak, I will briefly present you Ivado. So Ivado is an academic institute and its role is to support and promote digital intelligence and data science. More specifically, its principal mission is to do the connection between academic expertise and industrials. So if you can keep in mind only one picture of Ivado, it could be that bridge. More specifically, in health, we have grounded more than 40 research projects since our creation. We have 8 professors that are specifically specialists of digital health. We found 4 research professionals and more than 200 students. We also promote events such as symposium, and we organize trainings. So I will let Shalom, that I have the pleasure to share the co-animation with him today, present l'IID.
Hello everyone, my name is Shalom Pierre. I am the scientific and ethics at Institute Intelligence and Data of University Laval. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, je suis Shalom Pierre, je suis chargé scientifique et éthique à l'Institut Intelligence et Données de l'Université Laval. L'Institut Intelligence et Données a été lancé il y a tout juste 1 an. Et son mandat, sa mission, c'est de fédérer les expertises et l'innovation dans le secteur de l'intelligence artificielle et la science des données pour l'Université Laval et dans la grande région de Québec. L'idée intervient principalement dans 4 grands domaines: l'environnement physique, le domaine de la santé et de l'étude du vivant, les méthodes de d'IA et de traitement de données, et dans le domaine de l'éthique, la confidentialité et l'acceptabilité sociale. L'idée regroupe 32 chercheurs et chercheuses de l'Université Laval qui travaillent en étroite collaboration. Donc, l'idée, c'est vraiment d'avoir une approche interdisciplinaire et multidisciplinaire, donc ce qui permet justement de pouvoir faire un faisceau commun à l'Université Laval et pour devenir tel qu'on l'est déjà, que nous le sommes déjà, en fait, comme un pôle mondial dans le domaine de l'intelligence artificielle et de la science des données. Vous pouvez suivre les activités de l'ID. Vous pouvez nous suivre en fait sur les médias sociaux et si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez nous envoyer un courriel à cette adresse. Merci beaucoup et bonne présentation à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Alors, merci Shalom. Alors, aujourd'hui, nous accueillons Reg Joseph. Reg est le CEO de LCT à Edmonton. LCT est une organisation à but non lucratif qui met ensemble des cliniciens des innovateurs, des organisations philanthropiques et des compagnies, afin de développer des nouvelles avenues pour des meilleurs soins et à des meilleurs coûts. Aujourd'hui, il nous présentera comment son équipe et ses collaborateurs ont synthétisé un ensemble complexe de données de santé et ont évalué son utilité. So today, our guest is Reg Joseph from LCT in Edmonton. LCT is a non-profit corporation that works with clinicians, innovators, philanthropic organizations, and companies to develop new pathways of care that can drive better health outcomes and economic development in the health sector. So, Reg, this is your time to speak.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. First, when I get started, an apology because I am not bilingual. So unfortunately, my presentation will only be in English. But I'm pleased to present to you today some work that we've been doing around synthetic data and health. So the first I'd like to talk to you about, and many of you dialing in may know this already, some of the challenges that we're having around Canadian healthcare, particularly as it relates to our healthcare outcomes. And when we compare Canadian healthcare outcomes to other G11 nations, we have been steadily dropping over the last few decades. Now, there's only 2 countries that are below Canada in terms of this composite health outcomes measure. It's France and US, while the rest of our compatriots are actually above. And we are now below the 11-country average. And this is a ongoing challenge as we continue to drop with respect to healthcare outcomes in Canada. And the costs, of course, continue to rise. What's interesting here, and some of you may know this, is that Alberta actually, outside of the territories, is the most costliest jurisdiction in Canada per capita. And of course, our healthcare outcomes are middle of the level with respect to other jurisdictions in Canada. So it's not any better, even though we spend more money. But there is a real opportunity coming into health, and the disruption of healthcare with what I'm calling the new health economy is actually happening across the world. And many of these companies that you see the logos here are moving the needle in terms of new ways of delivering healthcare and driving better health outcomes. And when we look at the investment side of things, those companies that I presented just on the last slide are attracting huge amounts of investment internationally. And 2020 was a banner year, as you know, during the pandemic time. Particular technologies around digital health and virtual care, home health monitoring, really drove a large amount of investment in this space, as well as new launches and new products. And these companies are really driven by some fundamental technology platforms, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And as many of you on this call know, with the strength of Mila and others, we have international capabilities from Canada. Other platforms that are really driving this revolution are augmented and virtual reality and virtual care, Internet of Things. And so we have capabilities in all of these areas in Canada, and there's no reason why we cannot also have that level of economic growth and drive towards better health outcomes. Just a quick minute on Health City. Barbara had introduced it before. We are a nonprofit organization. We're nationally incorporated. Our funding model is multi-source. We have funding from all levels of government. We have industry funding for industry partnerships, and we also have funding from philanthropic organizations. For those of you who are interested a little bit more in Health City, We have a article published in Healthcare Management Forum. It just came out this month in the innovation issue of Healthcare Management Forum. And there is a podcast tied to that as well. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about our organization and some of the other work that we do outside of data, feel free to take a look at either the publication or the podcast. So one of the key things for those platforms that I mentioned earlier, of course, is data. And data is going to be a key enabler going forward. And as you know, many other jurisdictions around the world have embraced looking at data, connecting data, and using data to drive better public health systems. And again, in Canada, we have the data science capabilities, but honestly, we have not been using our public health system data to drive better health outcomes in the way that we could, given the types of tools that we have. Just a little bit of background on Alberta's data assets. This diagram was provided to me by the Institute of Health Economics. I did a rough map of some of the data assets located within the province. One of the challenges we've had in the past was that we have a number of disparate databases that don't speak to one another. But now, given some of the advanced data techniques that we have, some of the AI/ML technologies that we have allow us, some of these issues around disparate databases actually vanish, and we can actually start to harness the power of these multiple data sets. And we're just at the beginning from a global perspective on getting the value from data. Data continues to grow, as you know, exponentially, but yet the gap between that data growth and clinical utility actually is widening as the data assets grow, and the utility of that data is actually growing at a much slower growth rate. And so that gap is actually growing on an annual basis. And yet, from a federal perspective, we understand that integrating data is a key driver for our economic growth. There was a conference just a couple of months ago related to this, and looking at opportunities for how nationally Canada can start looking at data, not just in health, but in many sectors, and use that as a driver for growth within Canada. So I will talk a little bit now about synthetic data and the project that we undertook and some of the reasons for it and some of the results as well. Before I do start though, I'd like to give a very special thank you and acknowledgement to two of the data scientists that did all the work for this project. Health City was a sponsor, but the work was done by Dean Urich from the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta, and Khaled Elamam, who is a professor at CHIO and also is the CEO of a company called Replica Analytics. And we worked with Replica Analytics to do a lot of the work that we did around the synthetic data generation. And the evaluation of the synthetic data set was done by Dean Urich at the University of Alberta. So a special thank you to them, not only for the work that they've done, but the slides and the data that I'm presenting to you today is all from them. Before we get started on the actual synthetic data project, I'd love to talk to you about a project that my group tried to kick off almost 2 years ago now. And we were very excited to be able to partner with community-based health organizations, companies, a multinational company, a local machine learning company. And the real value here was to start to tie health data to social indicators of health. And one of the things that we realized was that there was a lot of gold in physicians' notes. The challenge for those of you who work in the clinical space will appreciate is that physicians' notes are unstructured data. And so we developed a methodology to be able to capture that unstructured data and analyze it, and then use that to correlate both with actual health data from the EMR, as well as start to look at combining that with social indicators of health data from social services organizations. It took us about a year to get the project set up, to work through all the permissions that we needed and so forth. We actually had a collaboration with CIPSIN, which is a national family physician-based database. And we actually announced the project. And as we were about to get kicked off on the project, we had to stop. And data access was the issue. We thought we had the right permissions from the data holders to be able to move forward, but there was some complications, and unfortunately, this project never took off. And so a lot of resources and time were spent into building this, and unfortunately, we weren't able to actually kick the project off. The problem with health data, many of you know, access to health data is challenging. In Alberta, for a typical ethics process, and to get access to health data, it takes a very long time. 18 to 24 months is sort of the average time. And there's issues with respect to privacy, even with de-identification and anonymization technologies. So if you look at the literature, you will find that there's a number of methodologies to be able to re-engineer to get back to the actual data when you're using anonymized data. And so there's still risks associated there. The real issue, though, with the lack of data, it's really preventing advanced data scientific techniques on health, and it's really preventing us from looking at health in a different way. Right now, as many of you know, most health science is being driven by a hypothesis-driven approach. And so you need to know ahead of time what are the variables that you're looking at, and then you need to make that request to the ministry, and then you can do your analysis once you get all the public approvals. The problem with this is, if we want to use artificial intelligence or machine learning, it is not driven by this hypothesis-driven type research. It's not driven by research clinical trials type approach. It's a chicken and egg type scenario. To be able to understand what you're looking for, you need to see the data first. And in the old-fashioned way of doing it is you define the problem first based on understanding what the data characteristics are, and then you ask the question. But for our AI ML scientists here, that's not how they work. They need to see the data, play around with the data, look at what those correlations could be, and then you can drive some hypothesis from that. What this does, though, is it results actually in very slow public health response. And unfortunately, as I showed you earlier, it also results in poor health outcomes. It's also impacting our data science training and talent. The inability of our data scientists and students to be able to get access to complex health data sets for learning, for training, for experimentation is actually holding us up as a nation in terms of moving forward on health data and data science. So to talk a little bit about the synthetic data team that we put together, the sponsors of the data project, it was Health City and the Institute of Health Economics. And then our partners are it's the company that I mentioned, Replica Analytics. We worked with the University of Alberta School of Public Health. We worked with a funding agency called Alberta Innovates. And some of you may know or remember in the province of Alberta, we have the Heritage Medical Research Foundation. The funding comes from there. And lastly, of course, we were very closely engaged with the Privacy Commissioner's Office on this project as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The overall objective is to move towards a scenario where could we eliminate ethics approval for the use of synthetic data? Is synthetic data safe enough that we will not need to go through a formal health ethics approval process. And that was the sort of the long-term goal here. The objective of this project was to basically create a synthetic data set in order to understand it better and see how it operates. We wanted to test two things: the utility of that data. So if you have a real data set and you have a synthetic data set, you interrogate each of those individually or separately. Can you come up with similar answers to your questions? And so therefore validating, is a synthetic data set of use? And the second, of course, is making sure that we can adhere to privacy considerations as well. So those were the key objectives of the project. So walking into some of the details of the project, we took a large opioid-related subset of multiple databases. So we took in provincial registry and vital statistics, which gave us, demographic type data. We have a pharmaceutical information network. We call that PIN data, which is basically drugs dispensing, and related information on how the drugs were administered and so forth. We also took emergency room visits and data from that. That's housed in the ambulatory care classification system. We also looked at discharge data. We also tied in administrative data from physicians' claims as well as lab data. So the N for the entire database is around 300,000. We took a random sample of 100,000 from that for our synthetic database project. And what we did was we looked at either morphine or oxycodone dispensation over a 2-year window. And then we looked at the other data in terms of emergency room, physician claims, and so forth over a 7-year window. And so that was the longitudinal analysis component of the study. To ensure safety, we did implement ahead of time a number of safeguards. So in that database, it was already a de-identified data set to start with. And we went through all the typical processes on this project. So it was set up as a typical research project out of the University of Alberta. It went through a formal ethics approval through our ethics approval board. And we also had data sharing agreements between all parties. So sort of all the check marks that you would do for a typical data project, we did for this as well, even though the long-term goal is for us to eliminate or streamline some of these activities if we can establish the value of synthetic data. So the process that we did was we took the real data and we trained a generative model on the original data. And then what we did was we captured the patterns, the broader characteristics of that original data. From that, from those patterns, we then created a generative model that synthesized the new data set from the above patterns, so that they would match the above patterns that we were able to get from the real data. And then, so by the time we did this, the new synthetic database had no original data in it all. It was all generated data. And as some of you may know, online right now, this whole idea of deep fakes that are out there, and the methodologies are very similar in terms of what's happening within deep fakes. And so the methodologies that we used on this process was a recurring neural networks model. And some of you who are on the data science side would understand, especially when we're doing longitudinal analysis, some of the issues with vanishing gradients, and that was addressed by using LSTM technology. And there is a publication that's been submitted that will actually go through this all in detail for those of you who are interested. So on the results, The first aspect of it is we wanted to see, was a synthetic data set useful? Did it give similar answers? Did it correlate well with the original real data set? And so a few techniques were used, Hallinger distance technique, the Markov transition matrices, as well as a cog regression model. And I'm just going to jump into the cog regression model for a moment here. Not going to get into too much details, but as you can see, besides mortality, and mortality did not model well in our synthetic data set, everything else did quite well. There was a good overlap of the means between hospitalization, emergency room visits, endpoints, and even other indications like pneumonia. All were mirrored quite well, as shown here by the Cock-adjusted model. So basically what we're able to determine is that from a utility perspective, the synthetic data set that we've created is useful, and it is very predictive of the original data. The second aspect is looking at the privacy assessments. And so we used an identity disclosure risk model, and this has been published. The model itself has been published in JMIR. You can look that up. I can provide you the source if you'd like. But the results of this data set had a replication ability, or being the ability to get back to real data, a value of 0.0019, which is orders of magnitude lower than many of the existing techniques around data identification or anonymization of data. So both from a utility perspective and from a privacy perspective, which are the two main questions that we were asking, this synthetic data set proved very valuable. And so this is just the first step. The first step was, could we actually create this data set, synthetic data set? Would it be useful? Would it preserve privacy? And that we've been able to validate. Our next step that we're doing now is to look at industry applicability of this. And so we are working with two pharmaceutical partners on two separate indications with the Office of Privacy Commissioner, as well as many other stakeholders, to look and see if we can generate a industry targeted synthetic data set for interrogation by pharmaceutical companies. Once we can demonstrate that level of robustness, we believe that we can now start using these synthetic data sets in rigorous academic test cases, particularly, as I mentioned before, the AI/ML test cases that many of our students and data scientists here would love to get access on. And if we can establish that, then really the long-term goal, as I mentioned earlier, is, can we move to a scenario where we have ethics-free data access by using synthetic data sets? And that is the end of my presentation. I'm definitely open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Reg, for the presentation. I don't know if you can see the question. There is one. Did you also try GAN architecture? Do you see it?
No, we did not. No.
Okay. And do you have other question? You can send them in French, and we will translate them for you. Oh, there is another one. What are the best practices to first test the quality of the modeling data, and to not overfit?
Yeah, okay. So for the first question, I mean, this is all relatively new in terms of being able to test the quality. So as I mentioned in the presentation, we used a couple of models there, and I can bring those up again very quickly. So for the utility, we measured using Hellinger distances on various data points. And then we used the Markov matrices as well, right? And then I showed you the data from the cog regression. So these are three different methods that we used. The scientists are actually submitted the first two assessments into a publication. And so I'm not at liberty to present to you the data for those two. But from what they have told me, all three tests proved that the synthetic data set was quite replicative of the original data set, in the sense that the data points were very similar and was of high utility. So that's what we use there. There are some other techniques that are being used in terms of being able to manage the whole idea of overfitting. And that is one of the biggest challenges, of course, as you know. Where we're going with that, though, is using, because we have this large data set of 300,000, once we've done the learning model, the training model, what we can do now is vary the N and take various different subsets and test to see what level of overfitting do we have on that, and be able to sort of start to measure those aspects of it. But again, this is relatively new, and I think when we start to push the boundaries in terms of other uses for this, we'll start to realize some of the issues around, more of the issues around the overfitting issue as we go forward.
Thank you. We have many, some others. So can you give us more information about your disclosure risk model evaluation? Thanks.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Can you give us more information about your disclosure risk?
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. So, you know what, that is not my expertise, but what I can do is that model has been published in JMIR, and I can give you the reference for it. So maybe offline, Shalom or Barbara, I can send you the reference that we used. That was published actually last fall. And so the full model details are in there, and that's the model that we used.
Thank you. Other question, what methods have you tested besides R and N?
Yeah, right now, this was the methodology that was used, because in terms of at least my understanding, and again, forgive me because I am not a data scientist, so forgive my ignorance here, but my understanding was that was the best model to use in terms of being able to have longitudinal data. And so I know that they have not tested any other models, but I don't know if they had looked at other models and decided that this was the only model that was applicable or not. But this was definitely the one that they thought was the best to be able to do the longitudinal database. Because what we had was, so not only did we have a very large N of a number of individuals, but we also had individuals that had received opioid dispensation and then touched the system in various ways, from labs, from emergency room visits, from physician visits, and so forth. And so there was a longitudinal aspect of it as well. And so my understanding from the data scientists was that RNN was the best technology to use. But I'm happy to check with them to see if if they considered any other models, and if they did not use those models for any reasons, we could find out why.
And thank you. And there is a question about your page, the page 22. So it appears that the confidence intervals for the parameters are shorter when estimated with the real data set than with the synthetic data set. This should not be the case since synthesis adds some noise to the data set. So the question is that, did you take into account the synthesis process in the analysis?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And my understanding is that that's where they used the LSTM. It was looking at the synthesis process. And so they've taken that into the analysis as well. This will be coming out, and the methodologies that they use for this in the forthcoming paper, which we can make sure to send to everybody when that paper comes out.
I think we have other question. Sorry? What do you think that will be the specific applications for the industry?
Yeah, so for there, I think, there's sort of two levels. One, if we look at the large industry opportunities, the ability to run what I will call a lot of virtual work before you actually touch real data is going to expand. And so the speed with which we can come to hypotheses will be much quicker, and the ability to generate new technologies from that will be also quicker. So I think that will be very interesting. The second part is also the ability to demonstrate real world impact and real world evidence using synthetic data. Which is a key driver for provincial budgets when they're trying to decide whether to list a particular drug or not, is sort of that real impact as opposed to the research clinical trial data that we have. So that's on the big companies. On the small companies right now, it's actually going to just be able to remove barriers. Right now, it is very challenging for small companies to be able to even understand if the approach that they're taking for their technology, whether it's a digital solution or a device or a drug, is even applicable or not, because their ability to access data is extremely limited. And so opening up that opportunity for smaller companies to be able to rapidly prototype and see, do they have something before they touch real data, is where we think the real opportunity is there.
Thanks, Reg. So a new question, is the re-identification probability estimate from the full data set or for a single individual?
For the full data set.
Okay. There is a lot of questions, so we keep going. When implementing AI ML in healthcare, the variety and idiosyncrasy of a patient profile is a challenge. Do you think your methodology could help anticipate unseen cases?
Yeah, Barbara, I'm sorry, I was speaking halfway through it. Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. So when implementing AI ML in healthcare, the variety and idiosyncrasy of a patient profile is a challenge. Do you think your methodology could help anticipate unseen cases?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is we hope. And honestly, and because we haven't even started interrogating the synthetic databases using AI ML yet. The whole idea was to get the Privacy Commissioner's Office, the ethics boards, comfortable with releasing these synthetic data sets from a privacy perspective, and then being able to start interrogating using some of these data techniques like AI ML. And so that's definitely where we want to go. We think so, but I think it'll be proven out as we start opening it up to those possibilities and start using those techniques against these databases, and see what those results are.
Thanks. So another question. Since synthetic data sets are built from real data sets, how does the process you presented solve the ethics committee issue? So this issue is limiting access to data for a long time research.
Yeah, so basically the theory is that there is no real data in the synthetic data sets. So all we've taken is the characteristics of the real data, and then we've synthesized the data to match with those characteristics, right? And so the data points in the synthetic data, if you take any singular point in the synthetic data set, it will not match to a real data point because it is synthetic. So there is no replication of data whatsoever. And so that is why the OIPC, or the Privacy Commissioner's Office, considers this as a potential viable option of bypassing ethics, because there is actually no real data in that synthetic data set.
I will have a question about that. And what do you do to have a more representativity of a population if you'd like to have a synthetic, a good representation with a synthetic data set? So do you have some ethic model do you use for that, or?
Sorry, what kind of model? Ethics models?
Yeah. So if you'd like to have a to have more representation in your data set, do you have a ethic model to? Yeah.
I mean, that's a good question. We haven't put a lot of effort right now in terms of looking at sort of the diversity of that data set. Mm-hmm. But that said, when we look at the population in the Alberta region, it's a small population, 4.5 million people, with a very diverse set of individuals in terms of genetic diversity and so forth, if that's the question that you're asking. So that we have a pretty good, a broad population that we're working from. That said, when we're doing some of these individual databases, like, this is an opioid test that we've done, obviously, that's going to be far more restricted in terms of what the cohort looks like and so forth. But overall, within the population in Canada, Alberta is actually a very good representation. It's a small, tight population with huge genetic diversity. The other advantage is that compared to other jurisdictions, in terms of longitudinal data, we have very low transfers in and transfers out in terms of the population. So there's a lot of cradle to grave data. I'm an example, born and raised here, right? And so, you've got 50 years of my health data all in one system. So at a gross level, we've addressed it, but we haven't started to look at that in terms of individual databases and looking at that level of diversity.
You can continue, Barbara, if there is another question.
Yes, there is a lot of questions for you, Reg.
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
So just to build on the question of Shalom, and maybe it's a very close, are there any risks to create some bias that can have some ethical issues, for instance, in the use of those data to establish health policers, for instance?
Yeah. No, and absolutely, and our scientists are well aware of that. And I didn't mention that in terms of when I showed you the next steps, what we wanted to do. There were kind of global next steps on big moves that we want to do, but scientifically, a couple of the next steps we want to do is really do a number of analyses on bias and understand, not only bias in terms of the synthetic methods that we're using, bias on the analytics that we're doing, but also bias on the collection side, as you know, that those all exist. And so being able to do full-scale bias analysis across the system is something that the academic groups will be working on a separate path.
How do you check if the joint distribution of the synthetic data set is similar to that of the original data? I mean, how do you assess to what extent the generated data is similar to the original one?
Yeah, and so this was a question that was sort of asked before. And so those methods that I showed on the slide before were the three different methods that they used to be able to validate how close the synthetic data represented the real data. And again, as I mentioned before, that will be coming out in a forthcoming publication. And so we'll be able to see some of that analysis in more detail and the actual data numbers there. And I apologize, I was not at liberty to present that data. The only one I was able to present was the Cox model.
How can you be sure that pharmaceutical companies will not try to re-identify people using other data sets?
Using other data sets?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think we could guarantee that. I think the whole point here is that because of the low rate of being able to re-identify data from synthetic data, we have sort of that built-in mechanism to prevent that. But other data sets, I don't think we can prevent that. And I mean, I think the standard ethics processes that we have in place today addresses that. The other thing I will mention, just because we are talking about companies and so forth, a little bit of philosophy around that is that the province writ large, they're not looking to monetize these data sets in that way, in the sense of saying, oh, we have a synthetic cancer database, and we now want to sell that synthetic cancer database to pharmaceutical company A, B, and C. That is not the goal here. The goal here is to start looking at key problems that we're trying to address within our region, and then bringing in industrial partners, their technologies, their capabilities to co-develop solutions for that, so that we would identify, if we've got issues around obesity and diabetes, this is a big challenge that we're trying to address. We would like to be able to bring in industrial partners to co-develop solutions, but how do we do that in a safe way? And we are proposing that synthetic data could be one of those safe ways that we can engage industry. So it's a different paradigm. I know most people will be like, okay, are you going to sell data? No, that is not the point. The point is, how can we bring industry into a sandbox with us to help solve problems? But can we do that in a safe way? Right now, it is very challenging because the current methodology is to bring them in to use real data. And the safeguards that we need to put around real data actually prevent us from using those advanced data techniques that could be very helpful in terms of driving public health. And so this is why we're doing this process.
Thanks, Reg. So a new question. We have to work just on sensitive variables or on all the data set?
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part of that.
We have to work just on sensitive variables or on all the data sets.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. So in this case, what we did was we just looked at sort of an opioid database where we had multiple inputs from different databases, right? So we had emergency room visits, we had labs, we had physician notes, dispensation stuff. So it was a very contained data set. It was a cleaned data set. It was a de-identified data set. So it was a very pristine sort of environment. And I'll be very frank, not replicative of a real world scenario. So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but if the person wants to do a follow-on, I'm happy.
So maybe the question, or I'm not sure to understand the question properly, but do you have to synthesize new data for the whole data set, or you target like specific parameters that are known to be very sensitive in terms of confidentiality?
Oh, yes. Yeah. What we typically do is, we do the entire database. So not just the, so yeah, even some of that information is is less sensitive, and some of it is even publicly available to some degree. But we synthesize the whole thing, and so that we don't have any sort of bias on those specific variables.
I have a question also, is that how we can deal with that kind of solution with data that we understand less. For instance, for genomic data, we're not sure to understand the whole genomic code at the present time. So how do you will think about that challenge in the case of synthetic data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, what we want to be able to do is, if we could start addressing and understanding the biases in the model and some of the, what's the word that I'm looking for? Some of the deficiencies in the synthetic data models, and once we understand that, then we can understand what those deficits and biases are when we apply them to unknown data sets. And so, because our ability to be able to test back against some of those biases and so forth in an unknown data set is challenging. So we'd want to actually understand very well those parameters in different data sets that we understand very well first. And then when we move that over to an undefined data set, understand that those how those biases are built in and how we can address for them. And honestly, this is just the very, very beginning. And so we don't know where that's going to lead us and what the utility will be for some of these unknown data sets. Ideally, that is exactly where we want to go, though, right? It's because when we don't know, that's where we want to do exploratory work. That's where AI ML comes really handy, is to start looking and finding these patterns that we would have never thought of before. But, those, and everybody in this audience well appreciates, those patterns, those correlations that we're finding, we have to have this level of certainty, or at least understand what the biases are in those algorithms that we're developing. And so that's what we're trying to establish now is, can we apply this to multiple different types of databases and get a better understanding of what those deficiencies and biases are before we apply them to unknown sets?
Thanks. Shalom, do you have a question?
I will. I think there is other question. Have you used a particular package or software for the creation of the synthetic data?
Actually, yeah, the short answer is sort of yes. It is a proprietary system that's being developed by Replica Analytics. And so it is not in the form of a shrink wrap software package yet. But I do know that the company, Replica Analytics, is looking to actually be able to start commercializing some of these tools and so forth. So right now it's a proprietary process.
Thank you. I don't know if there is other question.
I have one, so maybe.
All right.
So how do you think this data set, this kind of data set will be used further by researchers and industries? So maybe you will have one set of synthetic data set that you will release, and so you need to keep the version of it. I'm just thinking like concretely, like once you release the synthetic data set,
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And so the way we're thinking about it is less to do with, let's create a synthetic database and then release that and have it as a static database that people can interrogate. Where we really want to get to is a dynamic scenario. So we have a group of databases and then a user wants to test a question using particular variables, we then generate very quickly a synthetic data set for them to use. That's how we're thinking of it. So this whole version control aspect, and that we published a synthetic database and use it, kind of like we did before in the genetic research that we used to do and so forth. That's not the idea. The idea is to be able to be very dynamic and say, okay, it took us actually a number of weeks to synthesize this. But Shalom, to your question that you asked me before, we actually want to streamline that so that that somebody could actually make a request and we could turn around a synthetic database made up of multiple databases very quickly in a matter of a day or two, and then have that for that specific use, and then it's done.
Thank you. I think someone would like to have the title of the publication, and we will send it to this person.
Yes, sure. Yeah,
To have the specific methodology do you use?
Yeah, no, absolutely, we can do that. I can provide the title, and I will find out which publications which journals they've sent in for. I know that they've been accepted in a couple, so we can get that information back to you. It's all relatively new. They just submitted. So
maybe we can publish a link on the YouTube channel that will for this video, this webinar will be available. So this is one possibility.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're almost 1 o'clock. So Shalom, I let you present. So I will share my screen and let you present our next event.
Now. So the next webinar will be presented by Flavie Lavoie Cardinal. She's a professor at Laval University, Université Laval, and the title is Machine Learning Assisted Super Resolution Microscopy of Molecular Interactions in the Brain. Et ce sera le 18 février prochain à midi. Donc, vous y êtes chaleureusement et cordialement invités. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Professor Joseph, for your presentation. And if you have questions, you can send them to us, and then we can answer you with after, quand Professeur Joseph nous enverra tout ça, toutes les informations. Donc, sans problème, merci beaucoup d'avoir assisté à ce premier webinaire de Midi Santé et IVADO.
Thanks, Reg. Thanks, Shalom. And thanks to all the participants. See you soon.
Thank you.